The evening sun cast long golden rays across Pine Street as Mrs. Eleanor Jackson settled into her favorite porch chair. At 68 years old, she had claimed this same spot nearly every evening for the past 42 years. The wooden chair creaked softly beneath her weight, a familiar sound that had become part of the neighborhood's evening rhythm. "Evening, Mrs. Jackson," called Mr. Peterson from across the street as he collected his mail. She lifted her hand in a gentle wave, smiling as she watched him shuffle back toward his front door. Eleanor took a sip from her glass of sweet tea, the condensation cooling her fingers in the lingering heat of the summer evening. Her porch was her kingdom, a place where she could watch the world go by while remaining in the comfort of her own home. The porch steps were adorned with potted geraniums she had carefully tended since spring, their red blooms adding a splash of color against the faded blue paint of her modest two-story house. From her vantage point, Eleanor could see most of the block. Children were playing a noisy game of kickball 2 houses down, their shouts and laughter carrying on the early evening breeze. The Taylor family's dog barked excitedly from behind their fence, eager to join the fun. It was a typical Tuesday evening in a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone else, where Eleanor had raised 3 children and now welcomed grandchildren for Sunday dinners and holiday gatherings. She reached down beside her chair for her knitting basket. Her fingers, slightly stiff with arthritis but still nimble enough, began working yarn into what would become a blanket for her newest grandbaby. The repetitive motion was soothing, almost meditative. Eleanor hummed softly to herself, an old gospel tune her own grandmother had taught her decades ago. Mrs. Washington from next door called out as she hung laundry on her backyard line. "Those storm clouds look like they might bring some rain tonight." Eleanor glanced up at the darkening sky to the west. "About time. My garden could use a good soaking," she called back with a chuckle. A car she didn't recognize drove slowly down the street. Eleanor paid it little mind, probably someone looking for an address or making a delivery. But when the car, a police cruiser, she now noticed, passed by a second time, moving even more slowly, a faint unease settled in her stomach. Eleanor had lived long enough to know what it meant when police cruised through her predominantly black neighborhood without obvious purpose. The feeling was familiar, a holdover from decades of experience, of lessons passed down through generations about caution and vigilance. Still, she kept knitting, her expression unchanged. This was her porch, her home, her rightful place in the world. The cruiser turned at the corner, disappearing momentarily before reappearing and pulling to the curb 3 houses down. Eleanor's hands stilled, the half-formed blanket resting in her lap as she watched 2 officers step out. They stood beside their vehicle for a moment, speaking to each other while occasionally glancing in her direction. "Lord, give me strength," she murmured under her breath, setting her knitting aside and straightening her cardigan. She had done nothing wrong, was breaking no laws by sitting on her own property, yet experience told her to prepare herself. The children playing kickball sensed the shift in atmosphere and gradually quieted their game, casting curious glances toward the police car. Parents who had been chatting in nearby yards began calling their children home, their voices carrying a forced casualness that didn't match the sudden alertness in their postures. As the officers finally began walking in her direction, Eleanor took a deep breath and sat up straighter in her chair. Her son had always told her to keep her phone nearby for emergencies, and she was suddenly grateful for his insistence. She reached for her cell phone on the small table beside her, casually turning it face up where she could reach it quickly. The officer's boots made heavy sounds on the pavement as they approached her property line. Eleanor's heart beat faster, but her expression remained calm, dignified. This was her home, her sanctuary. Whatever was about to happen, she would face it with the same strength and grace that had carried her through 68 years of life in a world that hadn't always been kind to people who looked like her. "Evening, officers," she said as they reached her gate, her voice steady despite the knot forming in her throat. "What can I help you with today?" The 2 officers stood at Eleanor's gate, their hands resting casually near their belts. The taller one pushed the gate open without asking permission, the hinges squeaking in protest. "Ma'am, we've received reports of suspicious activity in this area," he said, his voice carrying across the yard loud enough that Mrs. Washington next door poked her head out her window. "Mind telling us what you're doing here?" Eleanor's fingers tightened slightly around her phone. 42 years in this house, and they were asking what she was doing here. "I'm sitting on my own front porch, officer," she replied, keeping her voice steady and respectful despite the absurdity of the question. "This is my home." The second officer, shorter with a crew cut, stepped onto the first porch step. "We're going to need to see some ID." Eleanor nodded slowly. "My identification is inside the house. I'll need to go get it." "Where exactly inside?" the taller officer asked sharply. "And does anyone else live here with you?" The way he emphasized "live here" made it clear what he was really asking. Did this house, this tidy two-story in a neighborhood that had once been mostly white but had changed over the decades, really belong to her? "My purse is on the kitchen counter," Eleanor explained calmly. "I've owned this home since 1981. My husband passed 5 years ago, but my son visits regularly." The shorter officer looked at his partner, then back at Eleanor. "Stay seated, ma'am. I'll accompany you inside to get your ID." Eleanor felt her heartbeat quicken. They wanted to enter her home, her private space, without cause. Every instinct told her this wasn't right, wasn't how things were supposed to be done. But she also knew the danger of refusal. Across the street, Mr. Peterson had returned to his front yard, pretending to check his mailbox again while keeping a watchful eye on the situation. 2 houses down, Mrs. Taylor had come outside and was standing with her arms crossed, her dog now quiet beside her. "Is there a particular reason you need to see my identification?" Eleanor asked, buying time as she noticed more neighbors becoming aware of what was happening. "I'm just sitting here knitting a blanket for my grandbaby." The taller officer's radio crackled. He stepped back toward the gate, turning slightly away as he responded to the call. The shorter one remained on the step, his eyes scanning the porch as if looking for something out of place, something to justify their presence. "We got a call about someone who doesn't belong in the neighborhood," he said bluntly. "Just doing our job following up." Eleanor felt a flash of anger rise in her chest, but kept her expression neutral. "I see. And what did this person look like? The suspicious one?" The officer frowned, clearly not expecting the question. "Ma'am, we just need to see your ID." Officer Thompson, the taller one, called, reading the name from his partner's badge. "Let's check the back of the property." Without asking permission, the taller officer began walking around the side of Eleanor's house. Officer Thompson hesitated, then stepped back. "Stay right there, ma'am." Eleanor watched as both officers disappeared around the corner of her home. She quickly pulled out her phone and dialed her son's number. When he answered, she kept her voice low. "They're here at the house." 2 officers. "Claiming there's a suspicious person. They're walking around the property now." She glanced toward where they had gone. "They wanted to come inside for my ID." Her son's voice was instantly alert. "Don't let them in without a warrant. I'm 15 minutes away." "Are the neighbors watching?" "Yes," Eleanor said, noticing that Mrs. Washington had now come outside and was standing at the property line, phone in hand. Mr. Peterson was talking to someone on his porch steps, his son, who worked at the community center. The Taylor family had moved closer too, standing in a group at the edge of their yard. "The community is gathering," Eleanor said, a small smile touching her lips despite the situation. The officers reappeared from the back of the house, their expressions hardening when they saw Eleanor on the phone. "Who were you calling?" the taller one demanded, striding back toward the porch. Eleanor kept the phone to her ear. "My son. He's an attorney. He'd like to know why officers are searching my property without a warrant or my permission." The officers exchanged glances, their confidence visibly wavering for the first time. "We're not searching, ma'am. We're responding to a call," Officer Thompson said, his tone slightly less commanding now. "But we still need to see some identification to verify your residence." Eleanor nodded toward the growing number of neighbors who had gathered. "I have about a dozen witnesses who can verify I live here." "I've been in this house longer than you've been alive, young man." A murmur of agreement rose from the small crowd that had formed. The taller officer looked around, apparently just noticing how many eyes were watching them, how many phones were recording. The taller officer shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable with the growing audience. His hand moved to rest on his belt near his radio as he scanned the small crowd of neighbors. "This isn't a public spectacle," he announced loudly. "Please return to your homes." Nobody moved. Mrs. Washington had her phone held up, clearly recording. Mr. Peterson's son had moved closer and was standing with his arms crossed, his community center badge still hanging around his neck. The officer turned back to Eleanor, his jaw tight. "Ma'am, I need you to come down to the station to verify your identity." Eleanor's heart jumped, but she kept her expression calm. "No, officer. I don't believe that's necessary. My identification is inside, as I told you. If you'd like to wait here on the porch, I can bring it out to you." "We can't let you go inside alone," Officer Thompson insisted, "for our safety." A low murmur rippled through the watching neighbors. Eleanor caught Mrs. Taylor's eye, saw the woman shake her head slowly in disbelief. "Your safety?" Eleanor echoed, her voice carrying just enough to be heard by those watching. "I'm a 68-year-old grandmother sitting on my porch knitting. What exactly do you think I'm going to do?" The taller officer stepped forward. "Stand up slowly, ma'am." Eleanor's phone was still connected to her son. She heard his voice, tinny but clear. "Mom, don't get up. Tell them you're staying seated until I arrive. I'm turning onto Pine Street now." Eleanor took a deep breath. "I prefer to remain seated, officer. My son will be here any minute. He's an attorney and can help sort this out." The officer's face darkened. "Ma'am, I gave you a direct order to stand up." "And I respectfully declined," Eleanor replied, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. "I have arthritis in my knees, and I'm not comfortable standing for long periods. I've committed no crime, and I'm on my own property." Mr. Peterson called out from across the street, "Leave her be. She's lived here longer than anyone." The taller officer spun around. "Sir, if you interfere with police business, you will be arrested for obstruction." While his partner was distracted, Officer Thompson moved closer to Eleanor, lowering his voice. "This could all be over quickly if you just cooperate, ma'am." Eleanor looked him directly in the eyes. "Young man, I've been cooperating my entire life. I've taught my children to cooperate too. But there comes a point when cooperation looks too much like surrender, and I'm too old to surrender my dignity on my own front porch." Something in her words seemed to reach him. His expression softened slightly, but before he could respond, the sound of a car door slamming drew everyone's attention. Eleanor's son strode up the sidewalk, his briefcase in one hand, phone in the other. At 45, he carried himself with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. His suit was perfectly pressed despite the evening hour, his tie loosened just slightly. "Officers," he called out as he approached, his voice clear and professional. "I'm Anthony Jackson, Mrs. Jackson's son and her legal representative. May I ask what's happening here?" The taller officer stepped away from the porch, placing himself between Anthony and his mother. "This is a police matter, sir. Please stay back." Anthony stopped at the gate, setting his briefcase down carefully. "I understand it's a police matter. That's why I'd like to know the nature of your interaction with my mother. Is she being detained? Arrested? Or is this just a consensual conversation that she's free to end at any time?" Eleanor watched the officers exchange glances. She could see the calculation happening behind their eyes, the sudden realization that what had seemed like an easy intimidation of an old woman had evolved into something far more complicated. "We received a call about suspicious activity," the taller officer said stiffly. "I see," Anthony replied. "And what was the nature of this suspicious activity? Do you have a description of the suspect? Does my mother match that description? I'd like to see the dispatch report, please." Officer Thompson cleared his throat. "We don't have the report with us." "Then I suggest you get it," Anthony said, his voice still professional, but with an edge of steel beneath the politeness. "Because from where I'm standing, this appears to be harassment of a senior citizen on her own property without probable cause or reasonable suspicion." Eleanor felt a strange mix of emotions, pride in her son, anger at the situation, and beneath it all, a deep exhaustion. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened in their neighborhood. She doubted it would be the last. But as Anthony climbed the steps to stand beside her chair, placing a protective hand on her shoulder, Eleanor knew one thing for certain. This time, at least, the script was about to change. The neighbors had formed a loose semicircle at the edge of Eleanor's yard. Mrs. Washington's teenage grandson had joined her, his phone also raised to record. The Taylor family stood with their arms crossed, their expressions a mix of concern and determination. Even old Mr. Chen from 3 houses down had wheeled himself over in his chair, a testament to how quickly word had spread through the tight-knit community. The tall officer, whose badge read Officer Daniels, spoke into his radio, his voice low but tense. Officer Thompson remained on the porch steps, caught in an awkward position between retreat and escalation. Anthony pulled his phone from his pocket. "I'm going to call Captain Reynolds at the precinct. He and I worked together on the Community Oversight Committee last year." He glanced at Officer Daniels. "Unless you'd prefer to handle this situation differently." "That won't be necessary," Daniels said quickly, his hand dropping from his radio. "We're just doing our job, following up on a call." Anthony raised an eyebrow. "And what exactly was this call about? What time was it placed? Who placed it? These are simple questions that should have simple answers if you're following proper procedure." Elena watched her son with quiet pride. Anthony had always been this way, measured but uncompromising when it came to matters of principle. Even as a boy, he'd stood up to bullies, not with his fists but with his words and unwavering confidence. Officer Thompson shifted uncomfortably. "Look, we got a call about someone who didn't belong in the neighborhood. That's all we know." "Someone who didn't belong?" Anthony repeated, his voice sharp but controlled. "And you determined that my mother, who has lived in this house for over 40 years and is known by every person on this block, was that someone?" A murmur of agreement rose from the watching neighbors. "She couldn't provide identification," Daniels countered weakly. "Because it was inside her house and you wouldn't let her retrieve it without an escort," Anthony replied smoothly. "Which, I should point out, you have no legal right to insist on without a warrant or exigent circumstances." Elena reached for her knitting, the familiar motion helping to steady her still trembling hands. "Anthony," she said quietly, "perhaps we could all calm down a bit. Officers, would you like some iced tea while we sort this out?" The offer, so incongruous with the tension of the moment, seemed to catch everyone off guard. A few of the neighbors chuckled. Officer Thompson looked genuinely confused. Anthony smiled slightly, recognizing his mother's strategy. She had always been like this, diffusing situations with unexpected grace, refusing to be defined by others' hostility. "Mom's right," he said, his tone shifting to something more conversational. "We can resolve this without escalation." He turned back to the officers. "Here's what I propose. My mother will show you her ID. I'll accompany her inside to get it. You'll verify she lives here, and then you'll leave. No report, no further questions." Officer Daniels looked like he wanted to object but couldn't find reasonable grounds to do so. "Fine," he said curtly. As Anthony helped Eleanor to her feet, Mrs. Washington called out from the yard, "We'll be right here watching, Eleanor. Not going anywhere." The statement wasn't threatening, it was protective. Elena nodded gratefully as she and Anthony moved toward the front door. Inside, in the privacy of her entryway, Elena finally let her shoulders sag. "This is getting to be too much, Anthony. It's the 3rd incident on this block in 2 months." Anthony squeezed her hand. "I know, Mom. But this time we've got witnesses, recordings. This time it's different." Eleanor retrieved her purse from the kitchen counter and pulled out her driver's license. "Is it different, though? Really?" She looked up at her son, her eyes tired but clear. "Your father would say it's just the same old story with new characters." Anthony was quiet for a moment, considering. Maybe. But the ending doesn't have to be the same. When they returned to the porch, both officers stood stiffly at attention. Something had changed in their demeanor, a nervousness that hadn't been there before. Elena noticed more cars parked on the street, more neighbors gathered. Word had spread beyond just their block. She handed her license to Officer Thompson, who barely glanced at it before passing it back. "Thank you for your cooperation, Mrs. Jackson," he said mechanically. "Sorry for any inconvenience." Anthony stepped forward. "Before you go, I'd like both of your badge numbers and the incident number for this call. For my records." The officers exchanged glances, clearly unhappy but trapped. Reluctantly, Officer Daniels pulled out his notepad and wrote down the information. As they turned to leave, Anthony called after them, "And officers? Next time you're in this neighborhood, remember, everyone here belongs." The officers retreated to their patrol car, walking with stiff backs and tight expressions. They didn't look at the gathered neighbors, didn't acknowledge the phones still recording their departure. Officer Daniels slammed his car door with unnecessary force. As the patrol car pulled away from the curb, a collective breath seemed to release from the community. People began to move closer to Eleanor's porch, no longer held back by police presence. Mrs. Washington was the first to reach Eleanor, wrapping her in a tight hug. "You okay, honey?" "My lord, the nerve of those two." Eleanor patted her friend's back. "I'm fine, just a bit shaken." Mr. Peterson's son approached Anthony, hand extended. "That was something else, man. The way you handled them, like a chess master." Anthony shook his hand, but shook his head too. "I shouldn't have had to. None of this should have happened." As neighbors gathered on and around the porch, Eleanor sank back into her rocking chair. The evening had grown darker while the confrontation played out, and someone had thoughtfully turned on her porch light. The yellow glow cast warm circles on the wooden boards, illuminating concerned faces and gesturing hands as everyone began talking at once. "Third time this month they've hassled someone on this block." "Remember when they stopped your grandson, Mrs. Washington? Boy was just riding his bike." "We need to file a formal complaint, get all this footage together." Eleanor watched them, these people who'd become family over the decades. Some she'd known since they were children. Others had moved in more recently. All of them now stood in her yard, united by what they'd just witnessed. Anthony raised his hands, quieting the group. "You're all right. We need to document this properly." But first, he glanced at his mother, noting the tiredness around her eyes. "Let's make sure everyone's okay." Mrs. Taylor stepped forward. "I called Reverend Lewis. He's heading over now." The mention of the Reverend, who'd led their local church for 25 years and had become the neighborhood's unofficial leader in matters of community justice, brought nods of approval. Mr. Chen wheeled himself closer to Eleanor. "You stood your ground," he said, his voice soft but clear. "You showed dignity." Eleanor reached out to squeeze his weathered hand. "We all did." She looked around at the gathered faces. "That's why they left. Not just because of Anthony's legal knowledge, but because they saw all of you watching. They saw community." A car pulled up, and Reverend Lewis emerged, his tall figure unmistakable even in the growing darkness. Despite the late hour, he wore his collar, a deliberate choice, Eleanor suspected. In their neighborhood, it served as both spiritual symbol and supple shield. "Mrs. Jackson," he said, climbing the porch steps with surprising agility for a man in his 70s. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, turning trouble into testimony." Eleanor smiled. "He certainly does, Reverend." The Reverend addressed the gathered neighbors. "Folks, what happened here tonight isn't just Mrs. Jackson's problem. It's a symptom of something bigger. But how we respond, that's up to us." Anthony stepped forward. "I propose we hold a community meeting tomorrow evening, get everyone's footage together, draft a formal complaint not just about tonight, but about the pattern of behavior we've been seeing." Reverend Lewis nodded approvingly. "The community center would be a good place. I can speak with Captain Reynolds directly. He's promised to address these issues before." "Promises aren't enough anymore," Mrs. Washington said firmly. "We need action." As the discussion continued, Eleanor felt a strange mix of emotions wash over her. There was still anger, still fear. Those never truly disappeared when you've lived through decades of similar incidents. But there was something else too, something warmer and more powerful. She watched her son as he spoke with the Reverend, outlining next steps with calm precision. She saw Mrs. Washington's grandson showing his footage to others, explaining how to properly save and back up the videos. She noticed how Mr. Peterson and Mrs. Taylor were already making plans to spread the word about tomorrow's meeting. This was what community looked like, not just in moments of crisis, but in the response that followed. This was people turning toward each other instead of away, transforming an individual injustice into a shared cause. The porch that had been the site of her humiliation was now the center of something else entirely: resilience, resolution, a refusal to accept what had always been as what must always be. Eleanor picked up her knitting once more, her needles clicking softly as plans formed around her. The blanket for her grandbaby would carry this story too, woven into its fibers, not just the confrontation, but what came after. The community center hummed with voices the following evening. Every chair was filled, with people standing against walls and sitting cross-legged on the floor. Elena sat in the front row beside Reverend Lewis, her cane resting against her knees. Anthony stood at the makeshift podium, a projector screen behind him. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice carrying over the murmurs. "What happened yesterday on my mother's porch isn't new to most of us. But this time, we have evidence." He gestured to Mr. Peterson's son, who clicked a button on his laptop. The screen filled with footage from Mrs. Washington's phone. Elena sitting calmly while officers loomed over her, their body language aggressive despite her composed responses. A ripple of anger moved through the room as people watched. Someone toward the back called out, "That's harassment, plain and simple." Anthony nodded. "It is, and it's part of a pattern." The video changed to footage from 3 weeks earlier, a young man being stopped while walking home from the corner store. Then another clip from the month before, an older man questioned while working in his garden. 8 incidents in our neighborhood in the past 2 months, Anthony said as the footage ended, all involving residents who've lived here for years, all involving officers from the same precinct, all without cause or consequence. Mrs. Taylor raised her hand. "What can we actually do, though? We've filed complaints before." Anthony looked at his mother, then back at the crowded room. "This time is different for 3 reasons. 1. We have multiple video recordings from different angles. 2. I've already spoken with the department's Internal Affairs Division and the Civilian Oversight Board. And 3. He paused, gesturing to the back of the room where a man in a suit stood quietly. 3. We have press coverage. The man stepped forward, introducing himself as a reporter from the city newspaper. "I'm here because this isn't just one incident. It's a systemic issue that deserves public attention." Elena watched the faces around her, saw hope competing with skepticism. They'd been here before, had been promised change before. What made this time different? As if reading her thoughts, Anthony addressed the unspoken question. "I know many of you are thinking we've tried this before. You're right. But here's what's changed: public perception. Cell phone videos have opened eyes. Social media has given us platforms. And most importantly," he smiled slightly, "we're more organized than ever before." Reverend Lewis stood slowly. "Brother Anthony is right. But I want to add something else. This isn't just about holding those specific officers accountable. This is about changing policy." He turned to face the crowd more fully. "We need regular community meetings with precinct leadership. We need better training for officers on implicit bias. We need clear consequences when procedures aren't followed. And we need representation at the table when decisions are made." The reporter was taking notes, his pen moving quickly across his pad. Eleanor found herself rising to her feet, leaning on her cane. The room quieted, all eyes turning toward her. "I've lived in this neighborhood for nearly half a century," she began, her voice soft but clear. "I've seen how things change and how they stay the same. What happened on my porch yesterday, it wasn't just about me. It was about all of us, about whose existence gets questioned and whose doesn't." She looked around the room, meeting the eyes of neighbors both young and old. "Those officers saw an old black woman and decided I couldn't possibly belong in my own home. That's not about bad apples or isolated incidents. That's about systems and assumptions that run deep." Anthony watched his mother with pride as she continued. "I don't want an apology. I want change that lasts. I want my grandchildren to sit on that same porch someday without fear." She paused, her voice growing stronger. "And I'm not too old to fight for that future." The room erupted in applause. Mrs. Washington wiped tears from her eyes. Mr. Chen nodded vigorously from his wheelchair. As the noise settled, Anthony stepped forward with a clipboard. "We've drafted a formal list of demands for the police department. We need signatures and we need volunteers, people willing to speak at the city council meeting next week, people who can help organize a community watch program, people who can document future incidents." Hands went up across the room, young and old, longtime residents and newcomers. The reporter moved through the crowd, gathering quotes and contact information. Elena sank back into her chair, suddenly tired but deeply satisfied. Yesterday, she had felt powerless on her own porch. Today, she was part of something larger, a community finding its voice, its strength, its path forward. 3 months later, Elena sat on her front porch in the gentle warmth of an early fall afternoon. The geraniums had given way to chrysanthemums, their deep oranges and reds bright against the faded blue paint. A fresh coat would be needed before winter came, perhaps a different color this time. Change, she had learned, could be good. She rocked slowly, the chair's familiar creak a counterpoint to the sounds of the neighborhood around her. Children played down the block, their shouts carrying on the breeze. Mr. Chen was being wheeled along the sidewalk by his grandson, raising a hand in greeting as they passed. The newspaper rested in Eleanor's lap, folded open to an article with the headline, "Police Department Announces New Community Oversight Board, Training Reforms." Her reading glasses perched on her nose as she studied the words again, still hardly believing what they had accomplished. The sound of a car pulling up made her look up. Anthony stepped out, briefcase in hand, tie already loosened after his day in court. He smiled as he climbed the steps to join her. "Have you read it?" he asked, gesturing to the paper. Eleanor nodded. 3 times already. "I still can't believe your name is in there." Anthony sat in the chair beside hers, the one that had been his father's favorite spot. "It's not just my name that matters, Mom. It's yours. It's everyone who showed up that night and kept showing up after." The article detailed the changes that had been implemented following their campaign: mandatory body cameras that couldn't be turned off during interactions, community members included in police training sessions, regular neighborhood meetings with precinct leaders, and, most significantly, a civilian oversight board with actual power to recommend disciplinary action. Anthony had been appointed to that board, along with Reverend Lewis and representatives from other neighborhoods across the city. Officer Daniels had been reassigned to desk duty pending completion of additional training. Officer Thompson had, surprisingly, become an ally, speaking out about the pressure officers felt to make stops without cause. "Did you see the part about the complainer?" Eleanor asked, tapping a paragraph lower in the article. Anthony shook his head. "Read it to me." Eleanor adjusted her glasses. Investigators determined that the call reporting a suspicious person on Pine Street was placed by a new resident who had moved into the area just 2 weeks prior. The caller, who requested anonymity, admitted to police that they had not attempted to speak with Mrs. Jackson before calling authorities. She folded the paper carefully. All of this because someone couldn't be bothered to introduce themselves to their neighbors. "All because they saw your skin and made assumptions," Anthony added quietly. Eleanor sighed, "Probably both." They sat in companionable silence for a few minutes, watching the neighborhood life unfold before them. Mrs. Washington was planting something in her front garden, her grandson helping with the digging. The Taylor family dog barked at a squirrel darting across the street. "You know what your father would say about all this?" Eleanor finally asked. Anthony smiled. "That it's just the beginning." "Exactly." She reached over to pat his hand. "He'd be so proud of you. Leading the charge, getting the press involved, speaking at all those meetings. He'd be proud of you too, Mom. Standing your ground that day, then telling your story over and over to anyone who needed to hear it." Anthony leaned back in his chair. Not everyone would have had the courage. Eleanor waved away the compliment. "When you get to my age, you stop worrying so much about what might happen if you speak up. You start worrying more about what might happen if you don't." From down the street came the sound of more cars arriving, Mrs. Washington's daughter and her family, the Petersons from across the way, others from the neighborhood gathering for the community dinner they now held once a month. Tonight would be the 3rd one, hosted in Eleanor's backyard. "I should get the tables set up," Anthony said, rising from his chair. Eleanor nodded but didn't move yet. "I'll be there in a minute, just want to sit here a bit longer." As Anthony went inside, Eleanor looked out at her street, at the place that had been home for so long. The incident on her porch had been painful, frightening, infuriating. But what had grown from it, that was something else entirely. She picked up her knitting from the basket beside her chair. The baby blanket was finished now, ready to be given to her newest grandchild this weekend. The next project was already taking shape between her needles, a bright, bold pattern that told a story of its own. A story not just of what had happened on her porch that evening, but of what had happened after, a community transformed, a system challenged, a future reimagined. Stitch by stitch, day by day, change was coming, and Eleanor Jackson, from her front porch, would continue to watch it unfold.